Imagine being trapped in complete darkness for days, maybe weeks, unable to move, sitting in your own filth, feeling insects crawl across your skin while sharp spikes slowly pierce your flesh with every slight movement. Now imagine knowing that this is just the beginning of your torment. Welcome to the story of the most painful punishment in human history, the Judas Cradle. But before we dive into this nightmare, I need you to understand something important. Everything you're about to hear is real. This isn't some medieval fantasy or horror story conjured up by a twisted mind. This was a legitimate form of torture used across Europe for centuries, and its effectiveness was so terrifying that sometimes just wheeling it into a town square was enough to make an entire village confess to whatever crime they were accused of. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh great, another video about medieval torture devices. But trust me, this isn't your typical Rack or Iron Maiden story. This is about something far more psychologically devastating. Something so methodically designed that it broke not just the body, but the very soul of its victims. And here's the truly fascinating part. We still have the original blueprints. Yeah, you heard that right. While most medieval torture devices are shrouded in mystery and speculation, the Judas Cradle was so meticulously documented that we know exactly how it was built, how it was used, and most disturbingly, why it was considered the ultimate form of punishment. But before I tell you about the device itself, we need to talk about the man who inspired its creation. His name was Heinrich von Wildhaus, and in 1468, he did something that would change the course of torture history forever. You see, Heinrich wasn't just any medieval torturer. He was an architect, and when the Holy Roman Empire commissioned him to design a new method of punishment, he didn't just create a torture device. He created a psychological weapon. Now, I should warn you, what I'm about to describe isn't for the faint of heart, but it's crucial to understand how this device worked because it reveals something fascinating about human nature and our capacity for both cruelty and survival. The story of the Judas Cradle isn't just about pain. It's about power, control, and the lengths humans will go to break each other's will. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this particular punishment was considered so effective that it was kept secret for centuries. You'll learn why even the most hardened criminals would break down at the mere mention of its name. And most importantly, you'll discover why this device wasn't just a tool of torture. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. But before we get into the gruesome details, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why it was called the Judas Cradle? The answer to that question is perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story. You see, just like Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, this device betrayed its victims with the promise of relief. The more they tried to escape their pain, the worse it became. It was a perfect metaphor for betrayal, wrapped in an instrument of unimaginable suffering. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking this is just another sensationalized history story, but here's what makes this different. We have actual court records. We have testimonies from both the torturers and their victims. We have detailed medical descriptions of what this device did to the human body. And most importantly, we have proof that this device was so effective at breaking people that it was used for over 300 years across multiple countries. So sit back, maybe don't eat anything for the next few minutes, and let me tell you about the most painful punishment ever devised by human minds. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at medieval history the same way again. And you might just gain a new appreciation for how far we've come as a society. Because if there's one thing the story of the Judas Cradle teaches us, it's that human beings are capable of creating unimaginable horrors. But we're also capable of learning from our mistakes and becoming better. Let's start with Heinrich von Wildhaus himself. Picture a man who spent his entire life designing beautiful churches and cathedrals. A man who understood the precise mathematics of weight distribution and structural integrity. Now imagine that same brilliant mind being tasked with creating something designed specifically to cause pain. Heinrich wasn't chosen randomly for this task. The Holy Roman Empire selected him because of his unique understanding of geometry and human anatomy. You see, in the 1460s, traditional torture methods were becoming less effective. criminals had started figuring out ways to endure the rack. They had learned to mentally prepare for the Iron Maiden. The Empire needed something new, something that couldn't be prepared for. And Heinrich, with his architect's mind, understood something crucial about human psychology. He knew that the anticipation of pain could be worse than the pain itself. The Judas Cradle began as a simple sketch in Heinrich's notebook. At first glance, it looked almost benign, a pyramid-shaped seat mounted on a tall wooden stand. But this wasn't just any pyramid. The angles were calculated with mathematical precision. Each face of the pyramid was designed to apply pressure to specific nerve clusters in the human body. The height was adjustable, allowing the torturer to control exactly how much weight was placed on the victim. But here's where Heinrich's true genius, or perhaps madness, came into play. He added almost invisible grooves to the surface of the pyramid. These grooves were filled with a mixture of salt and vinegar. As the victim's weight pressed down on the pyramid, these substances would slowly seep into any open wounds. The pain would increase gradually, almost imperceptibly, until it became unbearable. But that wasn't even the worst part. Heinrich designed the device so that any attempt to relieve the pain would only make it worse. If you leaned forward, the angle would shift to put more pressure on your spine. If you leaned back, it would target your most sensitive areas. There was no escape, no position of relief, no way to prepare yourself mentally for what was coming. The documentation we have suggests that Heinrich tested his creation extensively. He kept detailed notes about the effects of different angles and heights. He recorded how long it took for different types of people to break. These notes, discovered in a monastery archive in 1923, provide us with a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who turned architecture into an instrument of torture. But here's something fascinating. Heinrich never witnessed his creation being used. After delivering the final design to the Empire, he returned to building churches. Some historians suggest that this was his way of atoning for what he had created. Others believe he simply couldn't bear to watch his mathematical precision being used to cause such suffering. The first official use of the Judas Cradle was recorded in 1470 in a small town near Vienna. The victim was a suspected spy, and according to court records, he confessed to everything within 6 hours. Word of the device's effectiveness spread quickly throughout Europe. Soon, every major city wanted their own version. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The original blueprints were kept under strict lock and key. Only a handful of craftsmen were allowed to build these devices. Why? Because the Empire had realized something important. The Judas Cradle wasn't just a torture device. It was a weapon of mass control. The mere threat of being placed on the device was often enough to extract confessions. Towns that possessed a Judas Cradle reported significantly lower crime rates. But they also reported something else, a rise in false confessions. People became so terrified of the device that they would admit to crimes they hadn't committed rather than risk being placed upon it. This brings us to an important question. How many innocent people suffered because of Heinrich's creation? The records suggest that between 1470 and 1790, when the device was finally banned, thousands of people experienced the Judas Cradle. But the true number of its victims might be much higher, because unlike other torture devices of the time, the Judas Cradle often left no visible marks on its victims. The psychological trauma, however, was permanent. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to be sentenced to the Judas Cradle. According to surviving court records, the process began with psychological torture. Prisoners would be shown the device 24 hours before their punishment began. They would be forced to watch as the executioner carefully adjusted the height and angle. The anticipation alone was enough to break some people. But for those who remained defiant, the real ordeal was about to begin. The prisoner would be stripped naked, a crucial detail that made the experience even more humiliating. They would then be hoisted above the pyramid-shaped seat using a complex pulley system. This is where the true psychological genius of the device came into play. The prisoner could see exactly what was about to happen to them. There was no blindfold, no quick execution, just a slow, methodical lowering of their body onto the point. The first touch of the pyramid against flesh usually produced no pain at all. This was intentional. Part 3. The experience. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to be sentenced to the Judas cradle. According to surviving court records, the process began with psychological torture. Prisoners would be shown the device 24 hours before their punishment began. They would be forced to watch as the executioner carefully adjusted the height and angle. The anticipation alone was enough to break some people. But for those who remained defiant, the real ordeal was about to begin. The prisoner would be stripped naked, a crucial detail that made the experience even more humiliating. They would then be hoisted above the pyramid-shaped seat using a complex pulley system. This is where the true psychological genius of the device came into play. The prisoner could see exactly what was about to happen to them. There was no blindfold, no quick execution, just a slow, methodical lowering of their body onto the point. The first touch of the pyramid against flesh usually produced no pain at all. This was intentional. Heinrich had designed the initial contact to be almost gentle, lulling the victim into a false sense of security. But then gravity would begin its work. As more weight was placed on the pyramid, the pressure would gradually increase. The grooves in the wood, filled with that terrible mixture of salt and vinegar, would begin to make contact with the skin. The first hour was usually bearable. Survivors described it as uncomfortable but not unbearable. But by hour 2, the real torture would begin. You see, the human body isn't designed to maintain the same position for hours on end. Muscles begin to cramp, joints start to lock up, and every tiny movement to relieve the discomfort would cause the victim to slide slightly further down the pyramid. By hour 3, most victims were in absolute agony. The combination of their body weight, the precise angles of the pyramid, and the chemical irritants in the grooves created what one court physician described as pain beyond natural understanding. What makes the Judas cradle truly fascinating isn't just its physical design. It's the way it changed the entire concept of punishment in medieval Europe. Before the Judas cradle, torture was primarily about inflicting immediate, intense pain. But Heinrich's creation introduced something new, the concept of gradually escalating suffering. This shift in torture philosophy had far-reaching implications. Other torture devices began to be modified to include similar psychological elements. The very nature of punishment began to change. But this success came at a terrible cost. Communities began to fracture under the weight of paranoia. Nobody wanted to risk being accused of anything that might lead to the cradle. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Families began to distance themselves from anyone who might attract official attention. The psychological impact extended far beyond the direct victims. Children who grew up in cities where the Judas cradle showed higher rates of anxiety and paranoid behavior. Even centuries later, some European families still passed down warnings about the pyramidal seat. The device's reputation was so terrifying that it became a part of folklore. Parents would warn misbehaving children that the cradle rocks for naughty souls. These stories persisted well into the 19th century, long after the device itself had been banned. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Judas cradle was on the development of psychological torture. Modern historians have drawn direct lines between the psychological principles of the Judas cradle and certain interrogation techniques used centuries later. The device's legacy can even be seen in architecture. Several prisons built in the 18th and 19th centuries incorporated subtle pyramidal elements in their design, a deliberate choice meant to evoke subconscious anxiety in prisoners. But here's something truly fascinating. We're still discovering new details about the Judas cradle's impact. In 2018, archaeologists excavating a medieval prison in northern Italy found something extraordinary. Hidden in the walls were hundreds of tiny carvings, made by prisoners awaiting their turn on the device. These carvings give us unprecedented insight into the minds of people facing this terrible fate. Some wrote prayers, others left messages for their families. Many simply carved tallies, counting down the days until their scheduled punishment. These findings have revolutionized our understanding of medieval psychological trauma. They suggest that the mere presence of the Judas cradle in a prison was enough to cause severe psychological distress. Modern psychologists studying these carvings have identified clear patterns of anticipatory trauma. The artwork becomes more erratic as the prisoner's appointed date approaches. Some carvings stop abruptly, leaving their messages unfinished, silent testimonies to the moment their creators were taken to face the device. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Judas cradle is what it teaches us about human nature. It shows us both humanity's capacity for creating sophisticated instruments of cruelty and our ability to survive unimaginable trauma. The fact that we have accounts from survivors, people who endured this torture and lived to document their experiences, speaks to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. These survival stories, as horrific as they are, remind us of an important truth. Even in our darkest moments, even when faced with the most carefully designed suffering, humans can endure. And perhaps most importantly, we can learn from these historical horrors. The story of the Judas cradle serves as a powerful reminder of why we need human rights protections. It shows us why we must remain vigilant against the use of torture in any form. Because while Heinrich von Wildhaus's creation may be confined to museums now, the psychological principles he discovered continue to influence how humans inflict suffering on one another. So, what can we ultimately learn from the story of the Judas cradle? Beyond the gruesome details and psychological horror, this device tells us something profound about human society. It shows us how fear can be weaponized, how pain can be engineered, and how the human mind can become the greatest instrument of torture. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of how far we've come. The fact that we now study the Judas cradle as history, rather than use it as punishment, represents centuries of moral and social progress.